Hello, everyone. Dear students of mine in my social political philosophy course and my modern philosophy course, by popular demand, here I am with a long-winded lecture for you to round out the semester. In fact, this is two lectures in one. This will count as this week's lecture and next week's. I'm also posting this one on YouTube because other folks not in my classes may be interested. So for those of you who happen to be tuning in who are not one of my classes, just to let you know, this is a part of a series of supposed to be weekly lectures that I offer for my classes. And in this one, I'm going to be looking at some theory around a case study that's very personal for me, and using that as a chance for philosophic reflection pertinent to our courses. Let me show you an outline here if I can. Here we go. What I've got is 4 parts to this video. A little introduction. The 2 main parts are on theory. I'm going to introduce this idea of discourses or worldviews. And then I'll have this case study and then lessons learned. In between the theory and the case study, I have this, you'll see an orange slide that says pauze, which is Dutch for intermission. If you are only interested in the case study, then look for that. I don't know, scroll through the video, find that, and that's where you can pick up. For my students, of course, you're on your honor. You don't have to watch this at all, and you could tell me that you watched it, and I would never know. The beauty of doing the right thing, though, is it makes it easier to live with yourself. So hopefully you will tune in for the entirety of this. I think it's important. A note here a little bit. First of all, apologies. The quality of the video is probably going to be not so good because I'll have to use the pause function every once in a while. I'm going to try to play clips from the Texas Senate Affairs Committee on April 12th, 2021. There's a hearing on 2 bills, SB 1331 and SB 1646. You can find the videos here. I've got this link. There's a tool you can look up the bills there. So just kind of on my sources and where we are in this case study, these are 2 bills that would prohibit gender-affirming, life-affirming transitional care for transgender kids. And I'll get into that here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is walk you through these tabs I've got across the top here. Now, this was a painful experience for me, this committee hearing. And the idea here is to turn that painful experience into a philosophy lesson, to try to make something good out of it. So first, the painful experience, and then the philosophy lesson. The Texas State Legislature is considering 2 bills that would have me and other parents of transgender children classified as child abusers. Now, here's one of the bill's authors, Senator Perry, and this is in that State Affairs Committee hearing that I just mentioned, talking about his bill, 1646, and how it would classify the use of certain therapies, and I'll get to those in a little bit, as forms of child abuse. And I'll just play a clip for you here. Let's hope this works.
This stuff. So mine focuses on putting the parents responsible. If it gets classified as child abuse, then it takes care of all the other people that are associated with it, because doctors are supposed to report child abuse. Our required reporters are supposed to report child abuse, so it starts closing in the network of those that would impact the minor child.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hall, is it?
Okay. So he's talking about providing trans kids with evidence-based gender-affirming care, classifying that as child abuse. And here he calmly talks about the logic of his proposal to prevent kids from getting this care, because otherwise they'll be taken away from their parents. Child Protective Services would come into houses like mine and take away our kids. Now, after his presentation, dozens of medical professionals testified against this bill, and I'll get to some of that. So did dozens of trans kids and their parents, and they're not included in this video, but you can watch those testimonies. Yet this senator left the room for those testimonies. Now, it's true, he had other committee assignments at the time. But you might think that if you have a bill that will strip kids away from their parents, that you would find a way to at least be in the same room with them when they tell their stories. So that's a painful personal experience. And I want you to understand I'm angry about this. But I also want you to see in me a model of someone controlling and channeling their anger. Because this, I think, is one of the life skills we're trying to teach at a university. Know yourself, discipline yourself. Don't fall into a pit of rage and despair and violence. Put your energies into truth, justice, and beauty. Give yourself to causes that are greater than yourself. And on that note, that's the philosophy lesson I'd like to pull out of this. This is the mission statement for the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at UNT, and I just love it. Our mission is to kindle the thirst for truth, justice, and beauty, to foster cultural literacy and scientific investigation, to cultivate thinking and speaking and writing abilities characterized by clear expression and logically coherent, evidence-based arguments. We see these as values, forms of knowledge, and skills most needed by citizens of a democracy and by productive members of the global workforce. So the philosophy lesson is that being a citizen of a democracy, being a critical thinker, requires a lot. Sometimes it takes calming down a bit and finding patience. What I'm going to focus on here, in light of this mission statement, in support of this mission statement, is the attentiveness to framing, the way issues get framed, okay? How they're interpreted, what stories are told. And from a philosophy perspective, this is a lesson in rhetoric, in hermeneutics, or studying the art of interpretation. It's also a lesson in metaphysics, because this is how we construct reality. We talk about what things are, and it's a lesson in ethics. Overall, though, it's a lesson in political philosophy, because we do this together in venues like the Senate State Affairs Committee. So that's the philosophy lesson, and it's going to come in two parts. I have a theory and I have the case study. And so for my students, consider part one, this week's lecture. We get to the pausa. You can stop if you want, or you can keep going. And part two on the case study will be next week's lecture. Okay. Now, what's next here? Let's get to the theory. So here's the philosophy lesson, the theoretical aspect of it. It is the human condition to have reality appear differently to us as individuals. It's really quite amazing. This is what Hannah Arendt calls our plurality, or you might just call our diversity. In one of my classes, we've been studying the Federalist Papers, and in Federalist number 10, Madison says, quote, "The latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man, and we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society," end quote. He goes on to say, even when there's nothing really serious to debate about, people will find a way to disagree about it. So it seems to be the human condition that we see things differently often. We're not robots. We're not calculators. Even when we've got raw numbers to work from, we find different ways to interpret those numbers, different contexts to put them in. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get at. It's kind of a paradox. There's another way to put it. How can things be A and not A? Here's an example. The death tax, right? This, taking the IRS taking money from somebody's estate after they've died. That image there, and by the way, we are talking about politics, and we're talking about legal reasoning, we're talking about commercials. The kind of critical thinking we're doing shows up everywhere. Here they framed this as something horrible. Look, the Grim Reaper is going to come and take your money. That's the death tax. That's A. But here's the same thing characterized as not A, the estate tax. It's an increasingly insufficient source of revenue. And now you see, wait a second, maybe death tax sounds horrible, but estate tax is good, actually. You look in the US, you realize, oh, there's ways to make it more progressive. And oh my gosh, there's an exemption of $5.4 million, which means the government won't touch the first $5.4 million in your estate. So who are we actually talking about? Well, people who have a lot of money would have that money taxed. In the US, that number is way higher than other countries, you see. And you see this chart, the estate tax exemption has grown with time. So what is it? Is it an unjust, unfair robbing of somebody's estate who just died? Or is this a way to share as a community? Well, guess what? In our political discourse, it is A and not A. It's both of those things. Now, the person who has done, I think, the best to theorize this on this level is Deborah Stone. And I highly recommend this book, Policy Paradox. She's talking about the way reality gets defined. She says, politics is all about this contest, this struggle over values and ideas. What she says is that political reasoning, or we can call it critical thinking, is reasoning by analogy and metaphor. It's trying to get people to see a situation as one thing rather than another thing. The factions that form eventually between Jefferson and Hamilton, the death tax versus the estate tax, right? What else? I've got other examples here. What is welfare about? Is that a free handout? Or is it helping folks down on their luck? Or is it giving lazy folks, an unfair advantage? What about police brutality? Is that just some bad apples in an otherwise good system? Or are we looking at systemic racism? What about guns and mass shootings? Is this a matter of mental health and prioritizing our constitutional rights? Or is this a matter of safety and prioritizing gun control? What about environmental issues? Is that a swamp that we should drain for economic advantage? Or is that a wetland that we need to protect for its ecosystem services? Ad infinitum. And in this case study, what are these therapies we're talking about? Are these ways to provide life-affirming care? Or are these forms of child abuse? That's what we're talking about. It's a contestation, not just over ideas and values, but over reality, how we frame reality. Okay, now, more theory, push it deeper. This book, The Politics of the Earth, by John Dryzig. I also recommend it. He talks specifically about environmental issues, but it would work for any social issue. I'm just going to run down his main points here for you. Look, social issues are complex, yet somehow we make sense of them and form opinions about them, even with very little knowledge. How do we do that? Okay, everybody's got an opinion. You get on Facebook, you can see it. Everybody has made sense of every complex issue out there. Now, the more complex the situation, the larger number of plausible perspectives that can be put upon it, because it gets harder and harder to prove them wrong with a simple data point. This proliferation of perspectives is what Bruno Latour calls calls hybridity. We try to purify things and make them simple, but they keep getting complex and tangling up with other things. So how do we make sense of this complex issues? Well, we have what Dryzig calls a discourse, or I'm just going to call it a worldview. It's a shared way of apprehending the world. It's a way of making sense of the world, of giving meaning to it. These discourses or worldviews, they come complete with definitions of common sense reality, of legitimate knowledge, of assumptions and judgments about what's good and bad and right and wrong. One of the common sense things is, well, men don't belong in women's bathrooms. Earlier in Texas, the bathroom bill debate about transgender issues. That was kind of underneath all of the studies and everything was just this worldview, right? That was at issue. Discourses enable communication because they allow the like-minded to talk to each other without going down to fundamental axiomatic propositions, because they kind of share all that stuff. And so they know what each other's talking about. But of course, discourses also inhibit communication because they throw up these deep divides between people on these fundamental points. Discourses, here's an important one, are bound up with power, and they can embody power. They can become hegemonic. They condition the values and beliefs and perceptions of those who are subject to them. That's the way that one worldview becomes the assumed norm, or it gets to count things as what's normal and what's out of the norm. Now, just because something's a discourse, and you say discourses are important, it doesn't mean there isn't a physical reality, right? So just because we have to actively construct our worldview, okay, doesn't mean there isn't actually a world out there. Dreiser is very clear on this point. He says, where is it? Just because something is socially interpreted does not mean it's unreal. There is nature out there. There's a reality out there, he says. In his environmental cases, he's saying, yes, species in fact disappear. That's not just a matter of discourse. Forests can be lost. Climate change really does happen. Pollution is really there. You can't just word game your way out of this stuff. But the point is, we can't have a bare encounter unmediated by language and culture in our worldviews with reality. We're always operating in these discourses, these fundamental sort of filters for how reality shines forth to us. That's what he's talking about. Okay. In other words, it's never as simple as letting the facts speak for themselves, because people can make very different things of the facts. They have competing understandings. Some facts they will highlight and others they will downplay. So which facts are we talking about? Now, sometimes a particular discourse can be proven simply wrong, just flat out wrong. The moon landing was a hoax. Okay, right? But it's usually not that straightforward. Okay. Now, let me push the theory one step further with the greatest philosopher of all, Bob Dylan. The times they are changing. Last point on the theory, and then we'll summarize. So we're talking about how we frame things, and our debates being contestations over whether it's A or not A, What we haven't talked about is how these change over time, though. And the times are changing when it comes to our question around transgender issues, for sure. So if we had more time, we'd talk about how Kant said the human mind is active in assembling our experience. We're not just a blank slate. Okay. Heidegger says the truth is partly a matter of mirroring reality, but it's also partly a matter of constructing reality. That being changes over time. Truth, as the way in which the world is revealed to us, he calls it aletheia, which is an unconcealing. The way reality appears to us, that changes over time, he says. And in our modern philosophy class, that's one way to talk about what we're doing. If we're in the modern age, we have these kind of modern truths. That is the way the world appears to us, Heidegger says, is as something to be manipulated by science and technology for our control. Okay, that's what he talks about, this level of truth. Then let's add Foucault to it. Not only do these truths change over time, okay, but one mode of truth tends to dominate the others. It becomes hegemonic. And liberation then becomes a matter of challenging this hegemonic truth. For example, gay folks marginalized by society, changing the truth about their condition, and now trans folks engaged in that process as well. So the times they are a-changing. Summarizing our theory, and then we'll get to our case study. Frames or narratives is what we're talking about. The human mind is not a blank slate. It's not a computer or a calculator. Experience gets filtered through our culture, through what we've been steeped in, through these discourses or worldviews. The way we frame things is inevitable. It's going to happen. So be aware of those frames, yours and others. Notice what gets built into them, what doesn't get built into them. Listen to the folks who know more on the particular issue that's being framed, okay, and who are more experienced. I think this is true for everybody. It's especially true for our elected leaders. In both of our classes, we've been talking about power. Political power, John Locke says, is really the ultimate form of power, because the power of making laws with penalties. If this law gets passed, it would have the penalty of having my child taken away from me. This is serious stuff. Our elected representatives who wield this power have a special obligation, a special responsibility to think very critically and clearly and slowly about what they're doing, to think about their own biases and assumptions built into their frames, and to try to enter into other frames to see if maybe that's a better way to see things. That's to me what's going on here. Okay, like I promised, here's this button, pausa, halfway through. Probably not halfway through time waste because I want to play some clips now. But if you're looking for just the case study, here's a good place to join in. Consider this lecture 2 then, if you're in my classes. Okay, first a little context here. I've got all of these tabs for you in a Word document that I will post. Being transgender means that your gender identity is different from the one people assumed about you when you were 1 minute old. Being transgender is a part of the human condition that has been expressed for millennia in different ways in different cultures. Trans folks have a hard time in our culture for many reasons. Perhaps the most important, to connect it with the theory we've just been talking about, is the hegemonic truth or discourse or worldview that has been hostile to them. Strong religious beliefs about God's plans for us, about what we're supposed to look like and do, as well as outdated supposedly scientific beliefs about the gender and sex binary. Now, only recently has this hegemony started to crumble. It's crumbled under the influence of social media in many ways, which is a mixed bag, I think. This is complex. But on balance, I think it's positive because children today have the ability to see around them all sorts of different ways of being. And if they're different than their immediate, unmediated world of their school or their church or whatever, and they can see, oh, I'm different from these folks, but there's other folks like me, I think that's a good thing. It's a sense of belonging. It's a sense of fostering your quest for your authentic self. So yeah, the times are changing. I've got a stat here from the Williams Institute, which tracks a lot of stats on transgender and non-binary folks. Between 18 and 24-year-olds in the US, 700 out of 100,000, so that's 0.7%, identify as transgender or non-binary. When you look at 25 to 64-year-olds, that number goes down. Oh, I'm sorry, if you look at over 65, that number goes down to 0.5%. So there is an increasing prevalence of transgender and non-binary folks, genderqueer folks generally, in younger and younger generations. The times are changing. Now, look at this in a couple of tabs here. Look at this one. Self-reported change in support for transgender rights by different kinds of affiliation. Compared to 5 years ago, are your current views about rights for transgender people more supportive, much more supportive, more opposed, or much more opposed? And almost across the board, you see more supportive. All Americans, 62% now, are more supportive than they were 5 years ago. It's almost entirely flipped this way, except for one category, I think, here, conservative Republicans. Here's another one. This is looking at age, and do you know somebody who's transgender? Well, the first column is, do you know someone who's gay or lesbian? Look at those numbers now. I believe this is 2016, sorry. Wow, 80s, 90s%, right? Transgender, 30s, 20s. And look all the way down here, 65 plus. Only 16% of people in that age category say they know somebody who's trans. You know the problem with that? 65 plus, that's most of our elected leaders are in this category. But the times are changing. Now, let's get more specific. These bills in particular, what's at issue with them? Gender-affirming, transition-related care for transgender kids in Texas. This includes reversible puberty blockers, hormone replacement therapy, and eventually at older ages, surgery, gender-affirming surgery. 21 states in 2021, 21 state legislatures are looking at proposals to prohibit this kind of gender-affirming care. Texas is one of them. That would, if all of those laws were to pass, it would deprive 45,000, estimate, transgender kids of life-affirming care. The Arkansas legislature just did this. They just prohibited, they just outlawed gender-affirming care for children. And now, a very similar bill is being considered in Texas. There are two bills at this committee hearing. One, 1331, would make doctors lose their licenses and their insurance if they were to administer these treatments. 1646 would classify parents as child abusers if they were to allow their kids to undergo these treatment options. Now, the primary sponsor of Bill 1331 is Bob Hall, born in 1942, 79 years old. Now, why does he want to prohibit gender-affirming care? He's not an expert in this area. He's never talked with us or any other transgender families that I know of. He's never spent significant time with us or anyone else. He's not consulted with the doctors involved. He hasn't made a study of this issue. He hasn't walked a mile in our shoes. He hasn't spent a week at the clinic. But somehow he knows this is wrong. Right? He knows it's child abuse. And how does he know that? Well, because being trans is wrong. It's a problem. It's a mental disorder. And helping people to be trans then is wrong. It's child abuse. And how does he know this? He's got a discourse, right? He's got a worldview. He's got a truth, to use Heidegger's version of that term. He's got a way in which the world appears to him, the way in which the order of things is and should be, okay? It's an old truth. The times are changing, but it's a powerful truth right now. So he's got this discourse that takes this complex issue and it makes sense of it for him, right? And he's ready to act. He's ready to do it. Pull the trigger, you know? Let's listen to a little bit of what he has to say.
Peers. The individuals who prescribed and perform these treatments and procedures are effectively maiming children for life. These treatments are not just unproven, they are dangerous. One pediatrician from the Society for the Evidence of Base Gender Medicine stated that what we are doing now is a massive, uncontrolled medical experiment on children without adequate informed consent and without the backing of any kind of institutional review board. The state of Texas must not continue to allow these dangerous procedures to be performed on children. Senate Bill 1311 would protect children in Texas by prohibiting gender reassignment surgeries and other treatments such as puberty blockers and hormone therapies, by prohibiting professional liability insurance coverage for these surgery and treatments, and by revoking the license of those who prescribe or perform them. Bottom line, there is a natural cure for real or perceived gender dysphoria. It is called puberty. When left to nature's God, 90% of children solve their own problem by the age of puberty if they are not interfered with by misguided psychologists or mutilating chemical or surgical surgery by so-called medical doctors.
Okay, that's enough. He's got a couple of studies to cherry pick. He's got an outlying professional or two. He's got some stats to throw around without citing sources for them or contextualizing them. He can talk about the risks of the treatments. Of course, all treatments have risks, but he doesn't couch them in terms of their benefits. And that's enough. That's all he needs. That's all he needs to provide a patina of evidence to make it look like he's being drawn to this conclusion by reason and logic and morality, rather than being pushed into it by his pre-existing deeply set beliefs or his discourse. But in fact, that's what's going on. This guy has his dogmas in place. He already knew what he knew about this, and he was looking for things to rationalize that. Now, there's another thing I want to show you a little bit later on. Let's see if that one's queued up. Here we are, hour and 20 minutes later in the in the committee hearing. Note that bit he said about nature's God. That's the tell, right? That's the really important point. He's got this figured out. There's nature's God. God has a plan. God has an order of things. Listen to this now. Here we are, an hour and 20 minutes later, he's listened to one of his invited so-called experts who has a master's degree in psychology. And it prompts him to tell us about his childhood. And I think this was the most telling point in this hearing.
You said a couple of things that brought back a couple of memories to me. And listening to what Dr. Hopewell had to say and what Mr. Younger had to say, and the idea that this is in nature. God chose, for whatever reason, to put puberty where he puts it.
Yes, sir.
And we develop over time. And I was thinking back. Now, I went through a childhood that's farther back than most people that are here in the chamber had. But I can remember in elementary school, there were kids like you talk, some boys who become sensitive and some tomboys. Now, those are labels, but that's what it was. And that's just what it was in elementary school. But I can distinctly remember by the time we got to high school, every one of those sensitive kids made some of the toughest football players I ever faced. And those tomboys, almost every one of them was one of the best looking cheerleaders we had. And so they went through a time period when they just kind of grew out of where they started in elementary school, because we didn't have today's social.
Okay, all right. That's just what it was, he says, right? This is it. This is his narrative, right? In that deep sense, this is his truth. Look, I grew up and there were sissies and there were tomboys, but they all got straightened out and they became football players like all good boys are supposed to be. And they became hot cheerleaders just like all good girls are supposed to be. And that's the way God planned it, right? That's his truth. That's what people are bringing to this committee hearing. You can throw whatever facts you want at them. Statistics, even your counter stories. He's so deep in this one, he's not going to see out of it. Luckily, the times are changing, right? What does he leave out of this? What about those kids who were bullied for the rest of their lives? Or the kids who conformed just to get out of being bullied, but then led the rest of their lives shoehorned into some sort of normativity that doesn't fit them? He didn't see that, right? Here he is, cisgender, heterosexual, white man, conflating his moment in time, his own privilege, for the natural order of things. And gall dang it, he's going to foist that on everybody else. But the times are changing. Okay, but you say, wait a second. He's got experts. He's got facts. Let's look at one of his experts. In fact, he really only had one guy with medical credentials come in and testify about this bill. This is Dr. Hopewell. He's the 2004 past president of the Texas Psychological Association. He supports the bill to criminalize affirmative care. Let's listen to his rationale.
He was given guidance that the psychologist could only do affirmative care. Affirmative care means validating what the person is presenting. We don't do that with any other diagnosis. If an individual is depressed, I don't treat them and make them more depressed and affirm their depression. If they're schizophrenic, I don't affirm their schizophrenia and make them more schizophrenic. And I'm not aware of the Texas Psychological Association being under that guidance, really. Our ethics don't require it. And if the...
Okay, how about this for a framing? Look, we don't affirm disorders and diseases. We don't try to make people more disordered and diseased. Yeah, no duh. But you know what psychologists do? What they do affirm? They affirm positive mental states. They affirm well-being and happiness. Now, when one is allowed to be one's authentic self, be it trans or cis or non-binary or whatever, when that brings happiness and flourishing, well, that's affirmative care. That's just what it is. So his entire testimony, and you could listen to the whole thing, I've got you the link. It's based on its own narrative, its own framing. And this is a mischaracterization of what it means to be trans. It's a misframing of it. It's an outdated model that pathologizes gender identities that fall outside of the norm, the hegemonic norm about good old football players and hot cheerleaders. He's just slapping his own scientific credo on top of that discourse. And that happens a lot with science. I'm telling you, it's hard to be a critical thinker. When are you looking at an instance of somebody who's just gussying up dogmatism and biases in the name of science? And when do you defer to the scientists? It's hard to figure this stuff out. But let me suggest that he's got a framing of the issue that's outdated, and it's rooted in prejudice and bias and not evidence of actually what fosters a flourishing of these individuals. And if you don't believe me, that's fine, right? But let's listen to Dr. Megan Mooney coming up later.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Dr. Megan Mooney. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a licensed psychologist who specializes in treating traumatized children and adolescents, and I'm the past president of the Texas Psychological Association. I'm here on behalf of myself and the association in opposition to SB 16.
Oh, hold on a second. Here we go.
I'm passing out copies of my written testimony. I'm going to deviate from it a little bit just to speak to some of the comments that have been made earlier. You heard from Dr. Hopewell earlier today, who spoke and referencing his past presidency to TPA, and that is he is a long-distance past president for TPA, and unfortunately, Dr. Hopewell is not up on the current data and is not in step line with the association in our support of gender-affirming care for youth and their families.
Did you catch that? Okay, so they invited the 2004 president, past president. Here she comes and says, guess what? The times, they are a-changing. We, the association you thought was giving your testimony in support of these bills, we are adamantly opposed to these bills because we recognize now, we've learned that the affirmative care model is the right way to go. You got to keep your eye on the ball, right, with this stuff. Here we are 3.5 hours into this testimony, and you recognize that, oh, the key witness they brought in has been outdated and outdone by his own agency. Look, here's the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. This is their 7th issue of Standards of Care Guideline for taking care of trans kids, gender nonconforming people. This was in 2012. They had 6 versions before 2012. We are talking about a long-standing, thoughtful, multidisciplinary, evidence-based standard of care here. It's not something to be dismissed lightly on the basis of your good old stories about football players and cheerleaders. Now, there's one more video I want to play for you. And I'll play her testimony in its entirety. Because this standard of care is what all of the relevant major medical professional, mental health professional agencies follow. The American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, you keep listing them. Everybody says this is the right thing to do. It's absurd to call this child abuse. This is affirmative care and love, this process that we've got here. And it is a thoughtful, deliberative process, not a knee-jerk decision to rush into drugs. Let's listen to this testimony.
Get situated there and introduce yourself to us and give us your testimony.
Great, thank you. My name is Dr. Marjan Linnell, and I'm a practicing pediatrician here in Austin, Texas. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of myself as a mother, but also the Texas Pediatric Society, the Texas Medical Association, the Texas Academy of Family Physicians, the American College of Physician Services, as well as both the American and Texas Association of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Organized medicine stands united to strongly oppose both SB 1646 and SB 1311, which would cause incredible harm to the health of transgender youth in Texas and penalize pediatricians like myself and my colleagues for following the best medical practices to provide appropriate care. I think we need to remember that transgender children are first and foremost children. But as we've heard, they're also particularly at risk of feeling unsafe and reporting suicidal ideations. We know that when youth are provided with appropriate gender-affirming care, including puberty suppressors, the risk of lifetime suicidal ideation falls dramatically. Medical care for transgender youth is evidence-based and has proven effectiveness. Guidelines for appropriate treatment have been carefully developed and endorsed by multiple medical and psychological societies that are listed in the packet. I'll get to you guys in just a minute. This decision of whether and when to initiate gender-affirmative treatment is personal and involves careful consideration of risks, benefits, and other factors unique to each individual patient and their families. This process involves repeated psychological and medical evaluation with the participation and consent of both of the child's parents. Before puberty, there is no medical or surgical treatment that is used at all. I really want to repeat that because I heard something to the contrary earlier several times. Before puberty, there is no medical or surgical treatment that is used at all. Only after the onset of puberty is medical treatment used, and only in some patients. Treatment with medications to temporarily suppress puberty is reversible and allows the patient and their family time with the ongoing medical supervision of their doctor to explore their gender identity, access their supports, and further determine their treatment goals. As physicians, we need to be able to practice medicine that's informed by our years of medical education, training, experience, and available evidence, freely and without the threat of punishment. Providing patient care that helps rather than harms is our duty according to the oaths we all took as doctors. This bill rejects thoughtful and effective evidence-based treatments for a vulnerable group of children. Kids are a third of the population, but 100% of our future, and I'm here to make sure that all of those kids and their futures are supported.
Well, there you go. My apologies. I think I've been calling it SB 1331. It's the SB 1311. Hope you can understand. I've been a little bit distracted by this stuff. But here's a witness speaking for the organized medical professional community writ large. She's buried 3 hours and 17 minutes into the hearing. She gets 2.5 minutes, but this is it. So one of the critical thinking skills you need to develop is, as it were, to look for the needle in the haystack, and look for the ways in which things that don't really matter or should not have the credibility or authority that other things have, but they get blown out of proportion and they get all the time in the world. And then you see, wait a second, this person, among all the witnesses, her 2.5 minutes, this was the elephant in the room, right? She just told us what this is all about, if you're willing to listen, right? Okay, so that concludes the case study. There's so much more to be said, of course. But now I want to wrap it up here, a few lessons learned. First, well, actually, let me mention this. I want to say that in Arkansas, they passed a bill like these two in Texas that are being considered as I record this. It was vetoed, though, by the Republican governor of Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson. Hutchinson said, this is a step way too far. This is interfering in the private medical decisions of families with their healthcare practitioners. I'll say a bit more about him in a second. Here are my 3 lessons, though, simply. 1, check yourself. So when it comes to complex issues, exercise caution and open-mindedness, especially if it's something you're new to, right? Be aware of your own worldview or discourse and the assumptions that are built into it that will lead you to form your own snap judgments and your conclusions on an issue that you may know nothing about. Okay, check yourself, right? 2, listen to others. I also call this avoiding false binaries. Maybe things on the surface appear different, but maybe they're not so different as you thought they were. Maybe you're wrong, and an act of listening would correct you, and oh, how wonderful that is now to have improved yourself. So when you recognize your own limitations, seek out the points of views of other people. And this is why I think Governor Hutchinson deserves to be praised. This is exactly what he did. He wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post. You could pull it up. He said, you know what I did? I talked to families of trans kids, and I talked with the medical professionals involved, and I listened to them, and I learned. I learned that this process is nuanced, it's robust, it's deliberative, it's thoughtful. These aren't just quick decisions. And that for the government to come in and make a knee-jerk decision based on these encrusted worldviews, right, with their paper-thin rationalizations, it could make it worse for folks who are already vulnerable. Third, here's my biggest takeaway. Yeah, there are two discourses here, right? But more than two. When an issue is complex like this one, you're going to get that. And there's going to be some degree of legitimacy to different discourses, right? There really are, for example, risks to these therapies, of course. That's true of all medicine. There's risks to aspirin. Yes, okay, that's right, that's true. There really are people who later regret transitioning. It's true, but that's a small minority. So that's a risk, though. And yes, kids still have maturing to do. They're right about that. Yeah? But many of them have a solid understanding of their gender identity by a young age. And this process that we're talking about, this gender affirmation model that they want to criminalize, this process fosters such a deep self-understanding and reflection about who you are, about how you're going to flourish, that the children who go through this process are remarkably gifted and responsible thinkers who can make judgments that far outstrip their years. I've seen it. So it's complex, right? Of course, there's legitimate points of view. There's legitimate points to be made, legitimate concerns to be had. There are really risks involved. All of that is true. But look, don't just stop there with acknowledging the diverse points of view and their legitimacy. You might get stuck in a false equivalency. Ask yourself, is one story here, one narrative, one framing, one discourse, better than the others? Does it have stronger weight of evidence? Does it have more credible experts behind it? Does it have the experience of those living their lives at the center of this issue in it? And on this case study, the answer is clear. Gender-affirming care should not be prohibited. It should not be prohibited. It is a thoughtful, prolonged process involving numerous experts and loving conversations with kids and families about who they are and how they can flourish. And listen to that doctor, Marjan Linnell. She says, every child is unique. This has been the main theme of our social and political philosophy course. Our uniqueness. The one thing about humans is there's never been you before, and there's never going to be another you again. So you want a process that is tailored to the unique individuals, and that's what we've got. And sometimes this process makes them realize, oh, no, I guess I'm okay with the gender identity everybody thought I had at first. And sometimes they don't realize that. But other times it's clear that they know this is the path for them. And to rob the kids of this path, to rob them of this gender-affirming care is to erase them. It's to jeopardize their lives, literally. And so in other words, these bills constitute the act of child abuse. Okay, that's my long-winded lecture. I hope it was of some value. Until I see you in class, may the force be with you.